City engineer Lance Meyer says 51% of residents within the district turned in a letter of protest. However, he says it was not sufficient because North Dakota Century Code requires this type of protest to cover a majority of the land area. Meyer says the letters from the residents only cover 38% of the land area. Jennifer Rockwell, one of the residents who led the protest, says that detail was not communicated clearly. Otherwise, they would have approached it differently.
If everyone was asked, ensuring that their mail came through, because some people said they never even got the letter in the mail, and that they had a way to respond and understood the issue and their time constraints, that the area, which is what's required, would be over the 50% mark.
Streetlights.
City Manager Harold Stewart says a lot of the city infrastructure was built as far back as the 60s. Council members Carrie Evans and Stephen Padragula said their vote would set a precedent moving forward with future special assessments.
Let's try 35%. And I know it's not going to satisfy the residents of the community, but at some point we have to make hard decisions up here. This is unfortunately part of living in a community and an infrastructure that is deteriorating.
All council members but one voted in favor of updating the street light system. Now, this was in reference to the District 65 special assessment to update the street lights in that neighborhood, and we'll continue to follow that issue and have more information on our website.